And welcome to another reading lesson. Today we have a brand new text titled The Little House. We've explored this text a little tiny bit during our writing task, either choosing the city or the country. And in this story, the little house is curious or wants to learn about a new place. Before we dive into our reading thinking job, your teacher's going to pause the video and you guys are going to answer this question. Which places in or near your community would you like to learn more about? And what do you wonder about these places? Awesome. Today's reading thinking job is I can retell a story with key details. We've been doing this a lot lately. We did this with Tar Beach. We did this with Summer Sun Rising. We picked apart all of those key details to help us better understand what the story was about. So our reading thinking steps to get to our reading thinking job of I can retell a story with key details were first, we're going to talk about who is the story mostly about. Then we're going to focus on when and where is the story happening. And step 3, we're going to take those key details that we just talked about and put them in what happens at the beginning, the middle, and the end. So important to remember that finding key details are important parts of the story. We might hear questions like who is in the story, what happens in the story, where does the story take place, and what is the story mostly about. We're going to also focus on the major events. What happens at the beginning, the middle, the end. Remember, the beginning is when we learn about the characters and we learn about the setting. The middle is really when we find out what problem the character is having. And at the end, we learn how they solve the problem. Sometimes problems aren't always solved. And it's either going to be a happy or a sad ending, and it ends strong. So I love this book, and most of your teachers love this book too. So let's dive into The Little House. Before I start that, while you are watching, listening, and reading this text, your teacher is going to be making an anchor chart of all the characters, the settings, the beginning, the middle, and the end of The Little House, and we'll talk about it more when you come back. Enjoy. It's by Virginia Lee Burton. Once upon a time, there was a little house way out in the country. She was a pretty little house, and she was strong and well built. And the man who built her so well said, "This little house shall never be sold for gold or silver, and she will live to see our great-great-grandchildren's great-great-grandchildren living with her." The little house was very happy as she sat on the hill and watched the countryside around her. She watched the sunrise in the morning and she watched the sunset in the evening. Day followed day, each one a little different, but the one before, from the one before, but the little house stayed just the same. In the nights, she watched the moon grow from a thin new moon to a full moon, and then back again to a thin old moon. And when there was no moon, she watched the stars, way off in the distance. She could see the light of the city. The little house was curious about the city and wondered what it would be like to live there. Time passed quickly for the little house as she watched the countryside slowly change with the seasons. In the spring, when the days grew longer and the sun warmer, she waited for the first robin to return from the south. She watched the grass turn green. She watched the buds on the trees swell and the apple trees burst into blossom. She watched the children playing in the brook. In the long summer days, she sat in the sun and watched the trees cover themselves with leaves and the white daisies cover the hill. She watched the gardens grow and she watched the apples turn red and ripen. She watched the children swimming in the pool. In the fall, when the days grew shorter and the nights colder, she watched the first frost turn the leaves to bright yellow and orange and red. She watched the harvest gather and the apples picked, and she watched the children going back to school. In the winter, when the nights were long and the days short, and the countryside covered with snow, she watched the children coasting and skating. Year followed year, the apple trees grew old and new ones were planted. The children grew up and went away to the city, and now at night, the lights of the city seemed brighter and closer. One day, the little house was surprised to see a horseless carriage coming down the winding country road. Pretty soon, there were more of them on the road and fewer carriages pulled by horses. Pretty soon, along came some surveyors and surveyed a line in front of the little house. Pretty soon, along came a steam shovel and dug a road through the hill covered with daisies. Then some trucks came and dumped big stones on the road. Then some trucks with little stones. Then some trucks with tar and sand, and finally a steamroller came and rolled it all smooth, and the roads was done. Now the little house watched the trucks and automobiles going back and forth to the city. Gasoline stations, roadside stands, and the small houses followed the new road. Everyone and everything moved much faster now than before. More roads were made and the countryside was divided into lots. More houses and bigger houses, apartment houses and tenement houses, schools, stores, and garages spread over the land and crowded around the little house. No one wanted to live in her and take care of her anymore. She couldn't be sold for gold or silver, so she just stayed there and watched. Now it was so quiet and peaceful at night. Now the lights of the city were bright and very close, and the street lights shone all night. This must be living in the city, thought the little house, and didn't know whether she liked it or not. She missed the field of daisies and the apple trees dancing in the moonlight. Pretty soon there were trolley cars going back and forth in front of the little house. They went back and forth all day and part of the night. Everyone seemed to be very busy, and everyone seemed to be in a hurry. Pretty soon there was an elevated train going back and forth above the little house. The air was filled with dust and smoke, and the noise was so loud and it shook the little house. Now she couldn't tell when spring came, or summer, or fall, or winter. It all seemed about the same. Pretty soon there was a subway going back and forth underneath the little house. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it and hear it. People were moving faster and faster. No one noticed the little house anymore. They hurried by without a glance. Pretty soon they tore down the apartment houses and tenement houses around the little house and started digging big cellars, one on each side. Steam shovels dug down 3 stories on one side and 4 stories on the other side. Pretty soon they started building up. They built up 25 stories on one side and 35 stories on the other. Now the little house only saw the sun at noon and didn't see the moon or stars at all at night because the lights of the city were so bright. She didn't like living in the city. At night, she used to dream of the country and the fields of daisies and the apple trees dancing in the moonlight. Little house was very sad and lonely. Her paint was cracked and dirty. Her windows were broken and her shutters hung crookedly. She looked shabby, though she was just as good as a house as ever underneath. Then one fine morning in spring along came the great-great-granddaughter of the man who built the little house so well. She saw the shabby little house, but she didn't hurry by. There was something about the little house that made her stop and look again. She said to her husband, "That little house looks just like the little house my grandmother lived in when she was a little girl. Only that little house was way out in the country on a hill covered with daisies and apple trees growing around." They found out it was the very same house. So they went to the movers to see if the little house could be moved. The movers looked the little house all over and said, "Sure, this house is as good as ever. She built so well we could move her anywhere." So they jacked up the little house and put her on wheels. Traffic was held up for hours as they slowly moved her out of the city. At first, the little house was frightened, but after she got used to it, she rather liked it. They rolled her along the big road and they rolled her along the little roads until they were way out in the country. When the little house saw the green grass and heard the birds singing, she didn't feel sad anymore. They went along and along, but they couldn't seem to find just the right place. They tried the little house here and they tried it there. Finally, they saw the little hill in the middle of the field and apple trees growing around. "There," said the great-great-granddaughter. "That's just the place." "Yes, it is," said the little house to herself. A cellar was dug on top of the hill, and slowly they moved the house from the road to the hill. The windows and shutters were fixed, and once again they painted her a lovely shade of pink. As the little house settled down on her new foundation, she smiled happily, and once again she could watch the sun and moon and stars. Once again she could watch spring and summer and fall and winter come and go. And once again she was lived in and taken care of. Never again would she be curious about the city. Never again would she want to live there. The stars twinkled above her. A new moon was coming up. It was spring, and all was quiet and peaceful in the country. Enjoy the little house as much as I enjoy it. So let's dive into those thinking steps to get to our reading thinking job if I can retell key details in the story. So the first step is, who is this story mostly about? You probably talked about the story is mostly about the little house. Throughout the entire text, we learn about the little house. We also meet a great-great-granddaughter at the end of the book, and you might have added her to your characters. I added just the little house, as the little house is the most important character in our story. All right, let's talk about the setting. In text, sometimes you might find more than one setting. A setting is where it takes place. We had two different settings in this text. You probably talked about the two settings being the city and the country. Do you remember where the little house starts? Right, she starts in the country, and then she goes to the city, and then she goes back to the country. So the setting changes a couple times. I didn't put this on my anchor chart. You might have. We could also talk about when it's happening. We saw through the illustrations and heard through the words that some of the text took place during the day and some of the text took place during the night. So you could also put that key detail on your chart as well. Before we go to our beginning, middle, end, let's talk about the little house. In the pictures, what parts of the little house look like a face? And how does the illustrator show the little house being happy? Right. We can see in the little house that the illustrator makes the windows look like eyes and the steps look like a mouth. And the steps are curved like a smile. Throughout the text, the little house is happy and is sad. So, what makes the little house unhappy? Yeah, the little house becomes unhappy when she starts living in the city. And the text told us she didn't like living in the city. And she was very sad and she was very lonely. What makes the little house feel happy again? Right, she moves back to the country, which brings us to our beginning, our middle, and our end. Now that we know who the story is mostly about and where it's taking place, we've also talked about how the little house felt. So let's talk about what happened at the beginning. You might have talked about at the beginning of the story, the little house is in the country, and so wondering what it would be like living in the city. In the middle of the story, we learn that the little house is stuck in the middle of the city and things start building around her. And she starts to become sad and lonely and really doesn't like the city. The little house is not happy in the city. That's the little house's problem. Let's talk about how she solves the problem. Do you know how the little house solved the problem? Right. The little house is a thing. We know characters can be people and places, and a character can also be a thing. So the little house needed help. At the end of the story, we learn that the little house gets moved back to the country, and now she's happy. Who did she get help from? Right. She got help from the great-great-granddaughter of the person that built her. So throughout the little house, we learned that the little house really loved being in the country. She tried it out in the city, but she didn't really like it. Today in Seesaw, you are going to do just what you did during this lesson. You are going to be drafting your own mini anchor chart by drawing and labeling the characters, the setting, and what happened at the beginning, the middle, and the end. Until next time, bye, Kipsters!